Good afternoon and welcome to today's Health Justice Institute seminar lecture, which is co-hosted today by the Health Justice Institute and Professor Naomi Metallic in her role as Chancellor's Chair in Aboriginal Law and Policy. I'm Sheila Wildman, Director of the Health Justice Institute. We meet today and throughout this series in the unceded territories of Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples, sovereign nations holding inherent rights as the original peoples of these lands. We convene this lecture series with respect for those inherent rights, mindful of our collective obligations under the Peace and Friendship Treaties and Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, which, as you know, recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights in Canada. We at the Health Justice Institute further recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched this part of Mi'kmaq known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. The intransigent colonialist roots of ongoing health inequities endured by Indigenous peoples and nations across Wabanaki territory and Turtle Island, and the global health injustices of colonial capitalism driving our planet to the brink of extinction have been central to the conversations hosted through this seminar lecture series over the last many years. We have in the past welcomed Indigenous justice warrior Cindy Blackstock, and in the last 3 years, we've learned from Dr. Nicole Redfers, Director of Indigenous Planetary Health at Western, from U of T's Dr. Jeffrey Ansluis, on Indigenous health insights on suicide, climate change, and health justice. Lawyer Alyssa Lombard on using law to secure reproductive dignity in the lives of Indigenous people and nations. Alumni David Taylor on his ongoing Jordan's Principle legal advocacy. And of course, Dalhousie Law's own thought and advocacy leader, Professor Naomi Metallic, on substantive equality in First Nations social development and self-governance. This past spring, Professor Metallic and the HJI co-hosted a Law Commission of Canada funded workshop at the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Centre on Indigenous community-led disability supports on Wabanaki lands, with a report on that important conversation to be shared widely soon. Today, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome our speaker, John Syliboy, who is the now not so new my mouth is not working, the not so new but new Vice-Provost Indigenous Relations here at Dow. So I'm going to step back with that mouth work that I just did and invite Professor Metallic to say a few words about John Syliboy. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess in Dalhousie, Naomi Metallic, my name is Naomi Metallic, and Sheila said I'm a professor here, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, John Syliboy. John is meaning Mi'kmaq, from the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. As Sheila mentioned, he is now in the Vice-Provost Indigenous Relations role here at the university. John's role is to enhance Dalhousie's Indigenous communities partnerships, develop pathways into meaningful learning opportunities on campus, and expand on the work that Indigenous programming provides to benefit students, faculty, and staff for learning, teaching, and research. John collaborates on various regional and national research at the IWK Health Centre with the Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing Initiative. He is a co-recipient of a focused research investment grant from Research Nova Scotia to explore Indigenous health and healing for Ulnu children through Etuaptmumk, two-eyed seeing, which I'll speak about some more today, as you'll see from the slide. John's other interests include advocating to build support for Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQIA+, and he is the co-founder and former executive director of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thanks, Naomi. Wilalio. Wilalin. Naomi, Wilalin. Sheila. Gisku Begazin aimed at the Jibuktuk, whether Bexis is on Ya Millbrook. Gisku Agunudumulot and Go Chit, Ankidemug, Etuaptmumk, Ahwelodi. Gidu Ankidemug, Dan Lugudis Nug, Dan Deliaganadu, Kinug, Gijida Animinug, Dan Deliwemug, Dan Chakaptumug, research, Kisna, Gidu Agunudum, Gishka, Dama Delueg, justice. All right. Everybody, thank you for that. I put my timer on. I have my Tims on the side and a water bottle from the Faculty of Law here. Thank you for the introduction and also for the opportunity to share some of our knowledge. And I say our knowledge because it's from Wabanaki, from Ulnug, being Indigenous or First Nations and or especially Mi'kmaq. And also because it's something that cross-sections with what ownership looks like when it comes to our knowledge versus what I copyright as something that I could say is John R. But those are some of the intersections that we'll talk about when it comes to this presentation. I'll come to the image that you see up here with the left, which are Dijamishk. Dijamishk are spirits. And so when you have two spirits, you put the two in there. When you have more than two, then you just multiply it. So that's the rule of using petroglyphs. But I'll explain that in a second. Wedabexi means where I'm from, or who I'm from, or what community claims me. And in this case, I have my mom, who was a basket maker, and a long line of basket makers. That's my primary source of my knowledge, is through that matrilineal line of where I understand my language to come from, and how I think and how I speak is from my mother, first and foremost. And then, of course, contributor to that is my dad. And he's the one that's standing with me in the photograph. And he was chief of Eskasoni when he was only a young man at 26. So he's the youngest chief in Eskasoni, was the youngest chief in Eskasoni during that time, but also the youngest chief in the 70s across Canada. And his great-grandfather was Gabriel Syliboy, the chief on the left. And he would be my great-great-grandfather. And then the gentleman on the left, on my left here, is the Grand Chief John Denny Jr., who was the last Grand Chief, the last hereditary Grand Chief. And when he passed away, there was a mourning period, and then they selected a chief afterwards, which was my great-grandfather. So it went from my mother's side to my grandfather's side. So I had no choice to be involved in justice and or advocacy and or in self-determination or in governance or in politics, since I was before my time. So that influence I recognize and acknowledge, and I'm very proud of it. And also, I'm a product of Indian Day School. I went to Eskasoni primary, and I didn't realize it was a Indian Day School. We wouldn't know that then. I just went to school every day. I spoke Mi'kmaq at school every day, but we didn't speak it inside the classroom often, unless you were sneaking conversations with your colleagues in class. And so Marion, who was our grade 2 teacher back then, and my first cousin on the left, Sean, we were taught by this woman who was a great leader, and she became the director of education in Eskasoni at one point. So she was our grade 2 teacher. I always said that I woke up gay again. I had no choice. Look at the clothes my mother put on me. So I always talk about the fact that, my mother would have recognized some distinct qualities about being what we call Edujijamijuinug in Mi'kmaq, and as a Two-Spirit person. The Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance has a unique story. We started as an organization back in 2010. We first got together because there were tragic incidents happening in our community in Eskasoni First Nation. My friend and co-founder of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance is Duma Young. And I had just recently come out to my family and my community. I should just say my family. And I was working at Atlantic Policy Congress at the time. And I had a vast network of people culturally, but also through work. And so Duma reaches out to me and says, I heard that you came out. You got to get to work now. And I said, what are you talking about? So we were aware of the incidents that were happening in our community with the loss of lives. And we had to look at how we're going to address that, because we also wanted to know why that was happening and what were the causes, and also try to look at it from a perspective that's strength-based and or culture-based, not from a deficit perspective, which is often the case the way Health Canada or government looks at things, saying that's a tragedy, it's loss of life, it's suicide. And so we want to understand more than what that is and take the power of the narrative and control that. So we got together and had a gathering at the Liscombe Lodge. There were more than 50 people that came to there. All the First Nations around the region had sent somebody to attend. And so we had a series of discussions and conversations, and in those, one of the conversations turned into a sharing circle, and people shared their stories about coming out. And during that time, people shared their difficulties with their health, their wellness, acceptance, discrimination, but also, most importantly, why they survived and why they are here. And at that point, our elders that were there at this event told us, okay, if we're going to look at research through the lens of two-spirited people, we didn't have a word for it yet in Mi'kmaq, we need to look at it from a place of love or tradition and wealth of who we are. And that way we can celebrate who we are as two-spirit people. Let's study how we love and not how we suffer, is what the elders said. So that's how we were born out of that organization that way. We started as an organization without any funding. This is our catchment area, being all of the Mi'kma'ki, but also understanding that we had relationships with people from the Northern Labrador community, with the Innu and Inuit as well. We also had understandings with the the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot of the main area, and crossing over to the border area. That was our catchment area, if you will. And we always started looking at then why we are the way we are through our health. And we started understanding, and I presented this slide in Portugal and Spain. I said, this is what we got from you. I almost got thrown out of the event. But we just started to look at what have Western perspectives brought to our understanding as being Ulnug, and how that's impacted how we think and how we feel. And some of those, of course, are constructs. They're contemporary, of course, we know that. But we were just saying that a lot of the impacts from the Western world have really did a number on our people in our area. And I'll allude to some of that. But some of the historical aspects that we look at, starting from the first settlers and the baptizing of Salamo Member 2, and then, of course, the conflicts that took place, we did a timeline to understand how Two-Spirit people were impacted around the region and some of the policies that would have done that. We had, for examples, we have things that would have happened right off, saying when Salamo Member 2 had negotiated baptism, it was a negotiation. It was a process by which we had to understand that there's a danger of armaments and influx of modern warfare that these people brought, and we had a different way of looking at what warfare would look like. And in that negotiation, and there's conflicting views around the Concord.now, have you seen it? We were looking at how that would have been one of the outcomes, was that the Holy See would have said that the Mi'kmaq were allowed to live the way they honor their spirituality, whether it be Catholicism or a combination of that or a hybrid of that. But what really happened back then, and I spoke to Albert Marshall about this quite often, I call him Glamuksis, like uncle, is the first birth of how we would understand Etuaptmumk to be. That would be the structure of Etuaptmumk would have been born out of the hybrid of looking at our spirituality back then. So this is part of the ongoing conversations. Then we started having Etuaptmumk as a word that we would use every day, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But then integrate it into a process by which we look at it as a foundation or principle for knowledge gathering. whether it be for research or policy development or even looking at it from a legal perspective, it's a way in which we integrate our worldview into the, outside of our worldview people. So it would be with French or English or with Canada or the federal government, but it's part of that, and I'll go into that. But what we do want to say is that during this time here, we had the impact starting to come forward, especially with the Indian residential schools, Indian day schools. We would have had, for example, the Indian Act that brought the patriarchal laws, and that would have impacted the way in which Two-Spirit people would have celebrated union, or even how Mi'kmaq would have celebrated union. It was institutionalized to be a binary construct where male and female had to be brought together. So these were official policies that happened. Another official policy that happened was the fact that we couldn't celebrate our spirituality. We couldn't celebrate our traditional medicines, for example. We weren't allowed to celebrate these things, so they had to go underground. And when that happened, of course, that impacted memory and the collective memory of our thought process when it came to all of those practices, which also erased into the language, which erased into collective memory eventually. Those words that we may have had around Two-Spirit people or similar were impacted. So systemic patriarchy and heteronormative policies started taking place. We saw the anti-spirituality laws we talked about the Indian Act, residential schools, Indian day schools. In fact, the residential schools divided people according to male and female children. And anyone who didn't fit that binary understanding were forced into those situations. And of course, we have the 60 scoop, the children in care that you've worked quite a bit about. And of course, the whole justice system that's representative of over-representation of Indigenous people. So these are some of the impacts that we have in the judicial system, starting from this era. Then we also have how it impacted the Two-Spirit health of people. So we know that we talked about the heteronormative laws already, the patriarchal laws, the forced settlements that we had in Nova Scotia as well. We had centralization of Mi'kmaq that were either taken to Sibiganegadig or Eskasoni. And these were, they were impactful in the way that people were removed from their land and how they would celebrate who they are based on where they live. We have Mi'kma'ki, but we have districts of Mi'kma'ki that's divided into all of these districts. And it's according to these districts, we have systems and norms that are connected to the species and the land and the waterways that we would have had back then. So it's different. We have different Mi'kma'ki of Unama'ki than it is with, for example, the Gaspé region, right? There's two different ecosystems within the larger ecosystem. But we would have had language that represented each ecosystem. So when you're forcibly moved from one to another, then you're bringing in all these things and you're removed from that system of knowledge as well. And so all of those have impacted how we look at our worldview, how we express ourselves through language and culture, and of course how we impact our worldview when it comes to self-determination, self-governance, and anything else. Those treaty relations were starting to be affected. The kinship models that we would have had based on that ecosystem that we've been practicing for thousands of years were impacted because of these policies. So our sense of spirituality was also impacted. I'll give you an example. I helped produce a movie that's going to be coming out in April or May. It's called Skiredu Mujuegadik. Skiredu Mujuegadik means the place of spirits. It's like our place of spirit, like where our ancestors go. It's the Milky Way, for example. Well, that's where our ancestors are all based at. And when I was working with the director of this movie, and he came to me and he said, could we call this movie Skiredu Mujuegadik? I said, yes, of course. But they were looking at it from the place of ghosts rather than the place of spirits. And it's in fact called Place of Ghosts in English. We've toured it around internationally in film festivals. And people said, what's the place of ghosts? So the word Skiredu Mujuegadik, which would have meant to us spirituality and a place of spirits, we were told by Christianity and Christian leaders that we can't celebrate our own sense of spirituality, and that the place of spirits really is a place of ghosts. It's a ghoulish place, it's hellish, It's a place of destruction. It's almost like hell. And so that word that we would have had as an esteemed way of looking at our afterlife, now we started adopting ways in which to look at it as the place of bad place. So the connotation over years were impacted. And so that's an example of that. But we've had that take place with our bodies. We've had that take place within our land. We have that take place within our language, and I'll explain further. But we had all of these impacts start taking place in our communities, and then we started adopting new norms and reject our ways of thinking what gender was, what sexuality was, even what sex is. And we started adopting binary notions and understandings of what that is. Then we had Two-Spirit people, not only what we call Two-Spirit people in Canada, but all over the Americas, and based on my study, they were the first people targeted in the communities because they were the cultural knowledge holders of the community. They were the ones that passed down the laws and the language and the belief systems. So erase them would mean that we're conquering a nation a lot easier. And that's what they did, brutally, over and over and over throughout those years. So when I was introducing this topic to the Portuguese and the Spanish, and of course to our French and English friends here, it was part of that narrative. It was very common. And so the spiritual practices started going underground, and then, or just erased and or just forgotten over time. So the Two-Spirit identity goes underground, dormant or erased. Then we started excavating and saying, okay, well, it's not erased. We know that it's there because people are who they are. And then we started looking at then how that we should resurface that. When in our belief systems, contemporary belief systems started saying that Two-Spirit people were not only taboo, but they're also perverse. And that's the narrative that's been created against our people. And then we had to do a lot of unlearning and reteaching a lot of this education. And what I did is use our knowledge to do that. So I went into our worldview and I started analyzing through education and research what it is to be Ulnu as an identity, as a collective, and what it means for us to celebrate identity and traditional values that we've had, to understand that each individual has a spiritual right, but also an equal right to be who you are. And if it doesn't follow the collective, then we strengthen our resource to provide the person with enough resource that they have to understand then who they are, which may be different to what we believe, but we send them on a quest to find out who they are then. If they're trans or if they're bi or gay or lesbian, whatever their story is during that time, an elder would have told them, well, I don't know what it is, but then find out what you are or who you are, and then bring it back and help us understand. And so that's exactly what we've been doing. And so we hypothetically built what that would be pre-contact, but we also know from exercises and continuity of people's ways of celebrating who they are within our living memory and collective memory of identity, then we know that people were not persecuted in our Mi'kmaq community. They may have been teased, bullied, but they weren't outrightly ostracized by our community and our leadership. They were not celebrated, which is the other thing, that we may have celebrated people before. And so we started looking at that and seeing how that affects people's mental health and wellness. How does it affect your cultural well-being? Albert talks about cultural starvation or spiritual starvation. When you're hungry, you can eat. When you're thirsty, you can drink water. But when you're spiritually starved, where do you get the nutrition for that? You get it through language and land and commitments and kinship to our people. And so we have to rebuild that starvation back into a positive, strength-based process. And so we took part in the 2S LGBTQIA+ subworking group and building the cost of justice. We started looking at, out of the cost of justice, the 4 areas, the 4 realms we worked with were the rights to culture, to justice, to health and wellness, and right to safety and security. For Two-Spirit people, it was specific to us that we would do that, because in the TRC calls to action, we were omitted. We were not included in that process. And there are no outlining calls to action to support Two-Spirit people or people who are gender diverse or non-conforming. And we went back to Sinclair and said, what happened? Your own daughter is Two-Spirited. How could you have oversight like this? And so they brought us in. Actually, I call it snuck us in as an addendum to the process. And we had meetings in Toronto after the TRC was just drafted already. And we were told, don't worry, we'll work with you. But to this day, there is no TRC calls to action for Two-Spirit people. So they didn't want to make the same mistake when they did the MMIWG2S calls to justice. And we were included in that process. We were part of the authors. And so in the abstract of what I was trying to do with this dissertation is to look at how we can use two-eyed seeing to inform our way of understanding what gender and sexuality is and what sex is, for one part. Because there are no terms that existed in our language. Bernie Francis, who's a linguist here, I spoke to and I said, Bernie. And it was very surreal. I was coming from IWK and I was thinking I was putting my PhD proposal together for McGill. And there was one thing that I was still missing. I felt that I was missing something. And so I went for a walk at lunchtime and I walked through the public gardens, and it was a summer day. And I'm going back to IWK, still immersed in my own thoughts. And who do I meet up with on Spring Garden Road? Bernie Francis. And I said, Dalhousie, you did. Like I said, what are you doing here? And he says, oh, I'm just playing music. He plays music off and down at the waterfront. He says, well, this is really surreal. I'm thinking about this process and this language thing that I want to do with McGill, and I'm missing something. And he said, you know what we're missing? Language for sex. I said, oh, ooh, that sounds spicy. Tell me more. And he says, no, really, we don't have language for terms for our body parts, for example. They're there, but they've been bastardized. They've been turned into perverse words now. The word for vagina, for example, is turned into the equal word for the C in English. And for men parts as well. And so those were actual words that we would have had. They were bastardized and they were turned into perverse words by the Catholic religion in our communities. And so people started using them in a contemporary way like they would in English. And we wouldn't have that before. So, and I said, what's an example? So he tells me this. He says, okay, imagine you're a man and you're bending down and you're like this. What do you see from behind? You see two things hanging down, right? And I said, yeah, testicles. And he says, yes. But what do they look like? I don't know, testicles? He says, no, there is a word for it. They're called mistanchijil. I said, oh, interesting. Mistanchijil is lady slipper. And when you look at the lady slipper from the side view, you see that there's a mold that looks very much like testicles. And so we look towards our surroundings, our land, and our environment to understand how our images and how we explain these images into body parts or anything else. They're not metaphors. They're real things that we use to educate people. And so I started looking at this and I integrated that part into the PhD proposal and voila, it worked. And so I've been working with our community to do that, and I'll explain some of the process. So as you know by now, Etuaptmumk, the concept Etuaptmumk, is more than a concept. It's the foundation of our way of thinking. We've always had it. Etuaptmumk in this case it's a noun. We turned it into a noun because that's how Western science looks at things. As if it's a theory, then it should be a noun. But we would look at it as Etuaptmumk. It's an action-based verb. How we look at things is what it is. And so what I'll be explaining from the Indigenous side of this is we understand that Western perspectives and Indigenous knowledge work together respectfully, meaningfully, to address an inquiry of some sort, right? So that's the research side of how we're looking at this in a contemporary way. That's how Merdina and Elder Albert had brought it forward with Dr. Cheryl Bartlett. Coexistence of two knowledge sources in a co-learning journey, putting two knowledge sources together, and then we have an outcome, more robust than what we came with. But it's also a bridging of two worlds, and this was critical for Umnug as part of health justice, that we would have a tool that validates our knowledge at the same level that you would have for Western knowledge and science. But the process, I did the literature on all of the, I don't know how many hundreds of articles that there are now around two-eyed seeing or Etuaptmumk. A lot of it had to say that it's a methodology, it's a method, it's a concept, it's an abstract, it's a foundation, it's a theory, all of these things. And talking to Albert over and over and over again, he's been explaining Etuaptmumk is Etuaptmumk, simple as it is. It is a theory, it is a method, it is both of them together, and it is a collective of it, and it should be respected as a whole. When Western science starts looking at it as methodology and all this stuff, it's natural they do that because that's their training, right? And that doesn't make it wrong, it just doesn't make it right for us because it's supposed to be kept in its entirety as a wholeness of it. So once somebody speaks Mi'kmaq and I say Etuaptmumk, we understand it right away. We don't have to explain it, and we don't have to even interpret it or translate it. When I'm working with Janine Metallic, who's my supervisor at McGill, when we speak about Etuaptmumk in Mi'kmaq, we exactly know what it is. We don't have to go through a whole literature review to explain this. And in fact, I didn't do a literature review because I explained it as a primary source of how I've integrated my work with elders and the work we've done in research as the literature to build that knowledge. Not in that traditional, I'm going to have a chapter of literature review. I've integrated it and it's embedded into that. And so working with Albert, I've been working with Albert, well, I've known Albert all my life because I grew up across the Crane Cove Road in Eskasoni, and it's literally across the road where I grew up. Albert and Merdina's family were there. I didn't look at him as an elder back then, I just looked at him as Glamuksis Albert, and so was Merdina, Auntie Merdina. And when I started working with them, it was when I was with the Atlantic Policy Congress. And then when I started my master's, I started working with Merdina because she had offered to guide me along in using two-eyed seeing in my master's work to understand what is two-spirit. That was the first, part to that academic journey. And having conversations with Merdina, she had, because I asked her back in 2010, could I be a two-spirited researcher? Could I be a two-spirited researcher, but also could I do two-eyed seeing research as a two-spirit person? And she had asked me, did you grow up picking berries? And I said, yeah. Do you speak Mi'kmaq? And I said, yes. When you pick berries, did you follow instructions on how to do that? You knew how to go into the morning rather than the afternoon, go pick berries. You knew where to go pick the berries. You knew what time of the year to go pick these berries. You knew that you had to, if you were going into someone's property, you were going to go talk to that person and seek permission or at least seek their approval after the fact. And then you've also offered to whoever it is. And for example, I used to go pick berries in this man's berry patch. His name is Sulian Mossel. And Sulian used to love getting fish from us when we were fishing. I didn't like eating flatfish, so he said, bring them to me. He'd tell me if I go there in the morning, he goes, leave the berries over here. Or he'll tell me, bring pie in the afternoon. So that was the protocol. These are processes that were established. And so Merdina's point was, in her Socratic way of asking me all these questions, was to trigger that memory of protocols that I would have had to follow to pick berries. It wasn't just something that we did, but you knew how to do it, you knew the processes of doing it, and you knew that you weren't just picking berries to eat them, but you were picking berries for your family and for the elder that you're providing for. So she said, that's research, that's a methodology, that's part of what you should be doing. So I wrote about it in this paper writing that we have to do for PhD. And we started looking at it and expanding what two-eyed seeing is to understand coming out stories. And then I started expanding it in my research our research, I should say, but I'm part of the co-PIs for the pediatric pain research that we do at IWK. The word pain doesn't exist in our language, in Mi'kmaq. And we had to explain and explore why that is. So we had to understand, why doesn't pain exist? Because we don't have that word. We look at it from a verb-based word. I ache. I feel ache, or my arm aches, or my finger aches. So through Etuaptmumk and Etuaptmumk, we went back to the community and navigated that communication process and how that's influenced how pain is perceived now, not only from a mental and a physical perspective, but also including emotional and spiritual aspects. So we're expanding on these understandings based on our indigenous ways of looking at life, Ulnuwe knowledge, and expanding it for Western frameworks. So the paper that I presented on what is Two-Spirit is based on a Etuaptmumk account of that. And going back to approximately 15 years of looking at what identity is, from complex understandings from individual to collective, and the continuation of what gender and sexuality, and the continuity of what it means to be two-spirited in their process. There's no static understanding of what identity is. The only static identity we have is that I'm Ulnu, she's Ulnu, we're Ulnu. But everything else can be added to that. And so that helped to understand that part. And then I went back to Etuaptmumk, and I started looking at what are the primary sources of our knowledge. And so people call them methods, or people call them methodology. I don't call them that. They're primary sources of how and who and where and the process in which we think. The thinking process is an active that's individual and collective at the same time. That thinking process that I speak in Mi'kmaq is reflective of a journey of knowledge that's continuous and moving forward. These are very philosophical foundations. But we understand that our language is that it's continuous when you're speaking it, because it's action-based, it's moving in constant motion. So therefore, it's always non-linear, it's cyclical. And we go back to this source of that as we move forward. So when we're explaining the cultural foundations of our thought processes, we have to understand the fact that what I'm sharing right now is just an atom of a continuity of a system of knowledge breakdowns that we have, and norms. And those norms build into a collective framework of thought. And so I explained that in this paper. And then, remember I said earlier, there was indigenous knowledge and the Western perspectives. So I went back and started looking at this since 2018, working with our elders and our knowledge carriers, our linguists, our practitioners, clinicians, researchers, educators. Everybody's provided a source to come up with this model, which is the source of our knowledge. So Dalhousie means how we look at it. This is the strength of what being Ulnu is. This is the strength of being Mi'kmaq. This is our cultural knowledge, if you will, put into this model. So we have Ulnu'i Sudi, which is language. Dan Deli Ulnu'i is how I am Mi'kmaq. Dan Dalhousie is how we are acting as Mi'kmaq and how we think in Mi'kmaq. And then it works outwards. So we have our, the 7 sacred teachings, for example. We have here, through Ulnu'i Sudi, how we transmit knowledge. Agunu Demakan is how we speak it in collectives. In Syliboy Sudi is the way we understand, the ability to understand our language and transform it into codes of thought. And we got again is how I write it, or how I transmit it in communication. Those are examples how we do it, and it goes to the next part, adugwet, how one speaks it out. Bibamni gesimk, that means how one questions things. And it goes on, Ulnu'idism. And so we're speaking it outwards as well, what we're communicating. So these are all the processes in which we communicate and build knowledge. And those are the strengths of where our knowledge comes from. And so part of it can be elders, wisdom holders. Part of it is through ceremonies and cultural activities. Other things are things that we do, as in, you specify knowledge like we do in here. Like you're all lawyers or maybe studying law, but then you have specifications of law. And so we have people with those specifications, people that know about water, about fishes, about land, about forests. So we have those distinctions of knowledge. Not one person has all this knowledge. And it's the same in society. There's no one person that has all the knowledge of everything. So we have divisions of that. And so then we have the outer layers, which is our understanding of what Mi'kmaq is not only the land that we live on, it includes our belief systems through our creator, which is over here. What I said earlier, our spiritual world, which Siskamu is our earth, and Mi'kmaq is our land, Naguset is our sun, Depkanuset is our moon. It's all of it is Mi'kmaq. And it's the sources of that we understand it's interrelated. And so I explained this in this paper. It took forever. But because it's so much easier if I did it in Mi'kmaq. And I did it in Mi'kmaq. The difficulty was trying to get it and put it into words that are foreign to our language. And so as an action verb, I could say, ni Etuaptmumk. Ni Etuaptmumk is the first line. How I see it from a two-eyed seeing part. That's the action of how I see two-eyed seeing, right? But then let's say, I'm going all the way down, Gilo Etuaptmumk, how you see it, how you see two-eyed seeing. And so in the paper, I do expand on how that is. We have Etuaptmumk as a common everyday word that we would have seen, and when I would have said, I'm seeing two things. I'm seeing your perspective on something and your perspective on something. That's Etuaptmumk. That's me looking at it from two angles, right? But I could also go, and what Merdina and Albert had gifted us, is to use this foundation of knowledge to understand that we as Mi'kmaq have also the ability to understand through our worldview, our science, and integrate other worldviews to understand that at the same time. It can also be applied in a way that myself as Mi'kmaq, or Ulnu, I can apply it with Wolusteguig, which is our nation next door, and I'm seeing it from two-eyed seeing as well, from two nations that are different. It could be two nations that are even different from Canada. It could be us with the Lakota down south. So it's two-eyed seeing. But in the pure sense of what Merdina and Albert had thought about was the science that we use as the Western science and Mi'kmaq science. And we're looking at it that way. But it can be applied many different ways. And that's the point that we expand on the understanding for that. So how do we make pathways into addressing calls to justice using what we've learned, two-eyed seeing, and of course the research that we've gotten into looking at? We started having, like through culture, I won't go through every single one, but let's say for culture, we started looking at hosting regional gatherings. We needed place, space, and time to celebrate who we are as Two-Spirit people, reconnect people to the actual ceremony. When people say, how do you develop Two-Spirit ceremonies? I said, well, if you're Two-Spirit and if you're doing a ceremony, that's it. It doesn't have to be something that you do a whole recipe card around and you have to do it this way and follow all these protocols. No, you could be the Two-Spirit person leading that ceremony. That becomes Two-Spirited. And so, people often trip up against too much process and protocol when it comes to different things. But with your Ulnu, and you have the ability to apply this knowledge and transmit it and transfer it into other knowledge sources, then you're making that happen, right? The problem really is people getting stuck with who did what, how do I copyright that, and how do I turn that into something that I own? That image that I produced I produced the image because I used the diagrams and the knowledge to put into it. But it's not my knowledge. It's our knowledge. I can't copyright that. I can copyright the image and the colors that I use on it and the font that I use on the image. I can do that, but I can't copyright that knowledge. It's ours. So those are some of the examples we're looking at. So making pathways for calls to justice, the actioning of calls to justice. Again, we trip on the prescriptive process because government wants us to do it this way and check off that you've done that. We put money into it, the resources into it, and the explanation of that through a proposal. Then there's an evaluative process with that, checked off. No, we just live it. We have to live coastal justice and make sure that we implement those in every way possible. So looking at this image again, the two spirits, when I was looking at what identity is, and identity can be very complex. We're looking at identity from an Indigenous identity. We're exploring a proposal here to build a policy on what is Indigenous and making sure that we get it right in the best way possible. But when we're looking at identity again, we're looking at identity from a very linear approach quite often and a very static approach. Identity is always in flux, according to Mi'kmaq. You're a Mi'kmaq first. That's the most important thing. If you can get that right, then you're fine. Everything else comes into, understanding your identity is in flux. Your gender's in flux, your sexuality is in flux, combination of those, and your sex is in flux. There's no one person that when you're 20, you're going to be the exact same person when you're 40. There's no such thing. Physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. And if you can tell me and prove me wrong, please do so, because we've never seen it. And if we can come up with that magic pill, it'd be great. We want to look 20 forever. So we have this way of doing writing system called Gonkujigazigo. And Gonkujigazigo is suckerfish, suckerfish that are on the floor bed of the ocean. And they move around and they leave these symbols or pathways and all that. That's Gonkujigazigo. That's suckerfish writing. And so Michelle Syliboy from Wegolma talks about how we used this system of writing on birch barks or etching on different trees or rocks or different things. And it was to leave messages to the next person, this is the resource here, for example. So that's one way of explanation. So I started looking at two-spirited as meaning we found the image for spirit, which is the images that you see on here are like three spirits in that case. But we turned it into this image, more modern, which really is the same thing. It's the ungendered realm of an entity that doesn't have a female or male entity. It just is. It's an identity. And there's a center, because we all believe in a center of yourself, but then we have this stem going down that connects to the land or the water. And then this is the current part of the entity. And then we have these antennae, we call them, that reach out to the world beyond us. And our understanding of spirit from a two-spirit perspective is to look at the symbol as an entity. It's unseen if it's gendered. Therefore, we understand it's ungendered and it's non-binary. We also know it's a cultural image with a body, but also a spirit understanding there's a realm to the outer world. And this maintains the sense of identity of who we are as spirits. So the Catholic view of spirit was like the mind, body, spirit. And they started using and adopted our view of that and implemented it into Catholicism and into the writings of that. That's fine, but we know that that's still a spirit image of an entity that what we would understand as the realm of the spirit inside you. How does that lead to what we're talking about here? See these images here, you know what they are. Remember I was talking to you about Bernie saying we don't have language around body parts? Part of health justice is to understand the self-determination of our body. So we're doing work to understand language and bring it back to what the terms of the body are. And so there was really a fun way of looking at using two-eyed seeing to understand this, because in two-eyed seeing, we have the Western way of looking at these body parts, and we have the absolute way that we have with the naked eye of looking at the body parts. So through our science, we would have understood that bodies would have had names and organs would have had names visible to the eye, but we wouldn't have known these parts of the body at the molecular level until we saw microbiology take place. And from that, we know that there are names that were brought forward. That's why we have the word fallopian. That's not a word in Mi'kmaq. It wouldn't have existed. And so then we use our contemporary science and look at what that means. So I went to the elders and I said, okay, help me with these images. And it was really shy. Oh, I was shy talking to the elders. Give me an explanation what the vagina is and the parts of the vagina. I was very uncomfortable. But we had to make it as normal as possible. And they said, if you can make the language be respectful for an 80-year-old and for a 4-year-old, then you're on good terms. And so that's the way we looked at it. And so for the word fallopian tubes, for example, we started using Twi'tseing, saying, okay, we don't have a word for it from our old language because we would have seen this in the naked eye, but we know what the function is. And through that, we can name it now. And so when you look at it, it says, Don Wawul Weji Sabasigo. That just means, can anyone guess what that may mean? It's where the eggs go by. Literally is what it means. And so we were looking at it that way, and that's how they explained it. The uterus, for example, or the cervix, for example, the cervix, they call it enkadigan. That means the part that plugs that area. So the cervix acts as a canal for birth, but during pregnancy, it prevents the baby from falling through. So it plugs that area. And so they used enkadigan in that sense to keep the baby in the womb. And so that's how we came up with these words through Etuaptmumk. We did the same thing for the parts of the body as well, like for prostate, for the seminal vesicles. Those are the words that we looked at. And what they did so we know the word for example, gudada and a sperm. That's something visual you could see. So when you look at the word for seminal vesicle, gudadestaran wejia, it's where the sperm comes from. And so that's how they translated it, and that's how we were able to use it and introduce it. So we had elders look at these words. It was exciting for me to come up with these words again because we're reintroducing all this language back to the community. And that's an opportunity for us to rebuild what is sexual education, what we can introduce sexual health to our young people and to elders. We can also look at sexual health and prevention of STDIs, for example, through our understanding through language. And we're looking at all of these thanks to Eskasoni Health Center and the elders in Eskasoni that have been providing us with guidance. And we came up with these terms. So that's I need to defend this thesis. I already defended it with our community. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the most important thing to me. The bonus would be to get to PhD. The frameworks of hope we use for justice, for us right now, for Two-Spirit people, are the current treaties we have, the friendship treaties that we have here, the Peace and Friendship Treaty here in Mi'kma'ki, but we also have the other treaties that exist. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. They're still important documents because it gives frameworks for others to act on, even though there's an omission for Two-Spirit people. UNDRIP, the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, also is a main framework of thought, and it's a human rights-based process that we can go back and look at. And of course, the MMIWG2S Calls to Justice. So those are the big frameworks we're working with when it comes to this. And I use those frameworks in response to the work I'm doing for my research, is to look at how we can do that. And of course, the other outcome for this is to have new terms for Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, and bisexual. The word rolls right off your tongue. Edui jijame juinug. See that? Repeat it. Let's break it down and practice it. Edui jijamish juinug. So edui jijame juinug. I'll do it in 3, 2, 1. Edui jijame juinug. I'll have you practice. So we have that word, and we introduced it big and boldly at the Junos. So at the Junos, Anita Lambach, who's a medical student here, and myself had done the opening ceremony at the Junos, and we stood up there and said, we are Two-Spirit people. We said, Nina na Etuaptmumk, and we did it very bold and very large. And people in our community said, I've never heard that word. But we had already the blessing of the community that we could use from the elders. They said the process was that, almost done. The process was to introduce it. It has to be validated by 3 or 4 elders, language experts, and then we consult with our Two-Spirit community if it was okay to use that word. It made sense to them. Then we throw it right to the Junos and introduce it then. So it's out there. The other word, Etuaptmumk would be for all of the terms for Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, and bisexual. Like that be the term. But our language is rich, and we could further break it down to mean bisexual, gay, and lesbian. And so Bernie Francis and other elders had helped me do that. So for example, lesbian is ebiduiksadiget. In English, you often hear men who have sex with men, or women who have sex with women. Well, in this case, it's not like that. We're saying that women who have relationships with women, or women who love women. We're not basing it on what they do in the bedroom. We're basing it on how they should be loving each other. It's basically what the relationship is. The ideal is to love each other. The ideal is not to have sex with each other, which in English says men who have sex with men. That's the ideal, I don't know, but that's one identifier. And of course we have eduiksadiget and ginemuiksadiget. So edui, as you can see, for Two-Spirit and bisexual, very similar. Edui is the plural part of understanding what that means. And, but it doesn't mean dual. It can mean more than 2, right? So I asked the elder, can I use that term for pansexual as well? And they said, sure. But they said just use Etuaptmumk in that sense. So that's how we came up with these terms, and this is where we are with this process. Why is this important? Because it really brings back what reconciliation of language and our cultural beliefs are, and how we celebrate what continuity is. And we introduce this back to Eskasoni with these kids, for example, who are celebrating their identity in the way that they look at it. And so they adopt ways in which pride colors can be integrated into that, but they also celebrated it in the ways in which they did. You know, on that day they were beading, they were drumming, they were doing ceremony and dancing, not just wearing these colors, but actually celebrating what Two-Spirit identity would be. And that's where we are with this idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We have time, at least 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
Sure.
Feel free.
Is there anything that confused you, first of all? What do you think? Did it make sense, what we're talking about? Do you have a bigger understanding or a wider understanding of what Etuaptmumk is and what Etuaptmumk is? So the idea is that we take Etuaptmumk and we apply it to social justice. We apply it to legal frameworks. We apply it to human rights. Somebody had asked me the other day, how can we expand on the understanding of what human rights is? And I said, well, first of all, we are very naive to think that human rights should only be human. It should be more universal and inclusive of, we won't exist as humans if we didn't have the rights protected of our forests and our waters and our animals and our plants. So it's our sense of arrogance and entitlement that we use human as the main frame of thought when it comes to rights. That's only one component, and we can't exist without the other components. So we have to look at human rights from that spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional views. But not only from a human perspective, we have to look at it from a kinship perspective. It should be kinship of rights, really. And how we celebrate the rights of everything around us, that'll determine the well-being of our own existence. We have the privilege of having language and all these ways of communicating this, but if we listen hard enough to people around us, to our land around us, to our waters around us and to the plants around us, then we should be able to better represent in kinship their rights as well when it comes to social justice. And that is where we need to move towards when it comes to looking at this.
I had a question. Earlier in the presentation, there was an acronym. It was like MM2S and a couple other letters. I was just wondering if you could go back to that and explain what that was. It was quite earlier on in the presentation. Yes.
Which one? The MMIWG2S LGBTQIA+?
I was just wondering what that meant.
The MMIWG is missing and murdered women and two-spirited folks, right? That's that part. The 2S LGBTQIA+ is something that is representative of the acronym. So the two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. Plus represents others. I'll share something really quickly. 2S, the 2S at the beginning of the acronym is because of me and our organization here in Atlantic Canada. Back in 2015, we hosted the Interpride here in Halifax. And at Interpride here, they had LGBTQ2 at the end. And we often said, historically, we've been here since time immemorial. And we understood and respect the fact that LGBTQ, L at the beginning was to honor lesbians that have protected gay people during HIV and the process by which they were the caretakers in a time that was so atrocious. But we also were there as two-spirit people. And so I presented it to the Interpride here, and I said we should move the 2 to the front of the acronym. And so at that time, Halifax Pride said yes. The Pride organizations around here said yes. And we started doing it from here in Nova Scotia, from here in Halifax, 2S LGBTQ. And then we lobbied all those years, since 2015 until 2023, when finally federal government put 2S officially at the beginning of the acronym. And it's at the beginning of the acronym now. So that whole acronym is MMIWG, like the missing and murdered women and girls, two-spirited, and then the rest is the acronym for the two-spirit community. I sometimes just call it 2SQ. In some of the writing, I just put 2SQ plus, instead of going through the whole acronym part. But that's the part that we always get confused about. And we say Etuaptmumk is the word that represents all of the 2S LGBTQIA plus. We say Etuaptmumk. But we also say this because it'd be almost redundant to explain it in every single context. But we also understand that people need that. And for us, of course, for the two-spirit community, we understand that people have ways in which they present themselves. And so people have been impacted in their language capacity. I speak Mi'kmaq, and I'll always protect that. That's the best way to protect our protocols and our data and our knowledge sources, is to keep it in our language in our own body, rather than putting it in here, where it can be breached. And so we tell our people we have to really, protect our languages to do that, and then make sure that people understand that through our languages is the best way to, express who you are. And those terms, gay, lesbian, bi, they're static, and people often take those on as their identity first, rather than take on their identity as Indigenous. And so we say, no, it's Indigenous first, it's Ulnu first, it's Mi'kmaq first, then the other parts are components to who your identity is. Mm-hmm.
So I just want to start by saying how moved I am, as well as instructed I am by both the content and the way that you presented today. I think it's just been fabulous, and an illustration of what you are describing to us as to what it's seeing. And one thing I take away from your presentation is this idea of love, and I don't want to be reductive in saying that, but there's a couple of questions that I have around kind of the challenges and the opportunities of advancing the work that you have presented to us. And the first is around your own involvement in health research, and I know you have this big grant that you're involved in with other people from Nova Scotia Research Nova Scotia. And the thing that really stuck with me earlier, you were talking about pain and also all kinds of different forms of pain. But you mentioned that pain was like understood through the words "I ache," something like that. And then I was thinking how, you know, like you've been trying to do this constructive, this strengths-based research. So something like pain is obviously, you know, it's like not a great place to be often. But "I ache" makes me also think of desire. Like, you know, the "I ache" has those two resonances, at least in the English translation. And I just put that as kind of like a background to invite you to say a little bit about that research that you're doing, the Nova Scotia research, and how you met maybe challenges as well as opportunities to make that strengths-based in the way that you want. So maybe I'll pause with that one.
Yep.
I've had another one, but I don't want to go on.
Welodi, the title that we had before, and you said explain what the Welodi is, and I didn't want to like just translate it. Welodi is wellness, well-being. It's about the integrated understanding of being at a good place within your own space, within your own time. Welodi is achievable. And so we always had Welodi, and we still have Welodi. But the narrative around Indigenous health and Indigenous wellness has been taken over by First Nations Inuit Health. It's been taken over by Health Canada, stewarded by federal government, and to a certain degree by provincial. And so they've always looked at our wellness from a negative, deficit perspective. What's wrong with the levels of mental health? What's with the levels of diabetes? The cancer rates are growing in the Indigenous population. The suicide rates are this and this and this. It's a constant of that. And so when we look at Welodi, and we're looking at changing the narrative, that what we have to look at is how we are well and understand what wellness is from our perspective. Language, connection to land, land-based, our collective kinship relationships that we have that make us survive, and not only survive but thrive. That's us switching the narrative and making sure that we dictate how that is. I can get money real easily by government by identifying the cancer rates in Nova Scotia are very high in the Nova Scotia community. Our white savior aspect of Canada is to address that by saying, let's throw resources to it so we can address that issue. They will never give us money if we said, we're doing really well in Eskasoni with our language. Therefore, I need $10 million to continue preserving that. I'll never get the money. If I said, there's people committing suicide in my community because language has been impacted because of TRC, because of Indian residential schools, and mental health is increasing, then they'll throw the money in. That's how it operates. And so we've been conditioned to do that. Why does law even exist? Because of the mental deficit narrative that exists of what's wrong with our world rather than what's just in our world. And that is part of the process that we're trying to do, is build a narrative of healing and a narrative of wellness that we can achieve healing if we implement these actions by which Mi'kmaq show us what the way it is and use our clinical ways of doing it at the same time. We've seen many, many years and decades throwing pharmaceutical products to our community hasn't helped, right? It hasn't helped even our mainstream Canadian population. So we have to look at different ways of addressing these. But it really starts with resetting how we think about what wellness is. And this is a long systemic undercurrent because we're designed to look at what's wrong with our world. And that's the same thing that's wrong with Nova Scotia, what's wrong with our justice system, what's wrong with our educational system. It's all of those. And then we could look at it from Welodi perspective and look at the ideal and work towards it. That's how we should be looking at it. That's why we look at it that way.
Thank you so much. I know we're coming near the end of our time, but there was a question. Do you want to just say what?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. This was fantastic. Really great. I'm curious, and you found the word that I was looking for. You started off talking and how your approach to things were in a constructive way, where it's not bad and negative the way things have been changed into. Yet I found it interesting on your slide where you looked at the 4 parts, I think it was health and culture and whatnot. You had education on anti-gay, anti. Why anti? Why not the positive, like put that in a positive context, because again, by talking and education is part of what I do, and training, I find the words are so important in the mindset, and as soon as you see anti, it's reinforcing either the pain and the angst and the whatnot that it caused by being inflicted and a part of the target of that, or those who maybe don't appreciate what they're doing get hostile because you're inflicting something on. So
No,
why the
absolutely.
negative term?
Yeah, and those terms are not reflective of us. It's reflective of models that are out there.
Absolutely.
And so we were just using those models because of what pays for the programming. And even here at Dal, I'm one of the authors of the current cultural safety course that is done through health. And when I was having these conversations here at Dal, and I had been working with our elders and our clinicians across the region to understand what cultural safety is, it was really hard, and I had a lot of resistance from Dalhousie leadership to even say the word racist. They said, we can't look at racism in the coursework because it'll, I don't know, people would be shocked by it or whatever. There was an institutional barrier here to even look at racism, to your wording. And so I said to folks, I said, okay, well, I'll go back to our leaders and I'll say Dalhousie doesn't want to look at racism because it's too hard to have that conversation. The fragility we have institutionally, systemically, and nationally is very real. And how do we work with that? Like, it's language. It's powerful. But we also can have power through education to change that. And we have to confront it. Somebody said to me, well, why are you looking at pain then for research? We were not looking at pain as in, you know, the needles and the causes of pain for children. We were trying to build a knowledge and an awareness and a language around what pain is so we can make communication a lot better. And so we have to use the same language and flip it around. And so it is part of the process, and it is very challenging to, you know, change mindsets around. It takes a while. It's very systemic and it's very long process. And thankfully, we're doing we have a pre-licensure course here at Dal, but we've designed a post-licensure course that we developed for IWK. And now we've expanded it across the province to include physicians and other areas. And so we're looking at the behavioral changes that are happening for healthcare clinicians to understand what Indigenous health and Ulnu health is. And once we have that, once we start saying those words and not be afraid to say those words, then it becomes easier to have that communication and part of that problem to be addressed. But if we can't say the word, how are we going to address it? That was some of the challenges we had before. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
I'm just going to say a couple words of thank you. I really can't say enough, and I'm hoping that this is just the start of more conversations. And it's true, when you gave me your title originally, I got back to John and said, I don't know, should we put you have a word and then you have a colon, and then you have kind of like more on the word. And John was kind of like, no, this is my title. And I just love how it's like an invitation, right, to come and engage and be educated around so that we can start to engage in two-eyed seeing in a way that is more like legitimately open and engaging as opposed to expecting, all the work to be done on the other side. So again, I just want to be, I speak also for my colleague Naomi, who had an unavoidable other thing that she delayed as long as possible before having to go for that. But I know that both the Chancellor's Chair and us at the Health Justice Institute, are so grateful for this start of a conversation. I want to also just mention that our next seminar or lecture is 2 weeks from now, which is pretty quick because we have Reading Week just coming up. It's February 27th, and it's Canada's federal housing advocate, Marie Jose Poole, who is, this is a big deal that we have the federal housing advocate coming to speak to us. You might know that it's a position created under legislation, and they make recommendations to the federal government around the right to housing, and they do sort of very specific issues-based and thematic reports each year, and they're spending some time here in Atlantic Canada to kind of talk to people and look around and learn and give this lecture to us. So I encourage you to really talk it up and bring people out, because we want to make sure that the many voices of folks differentially impacted by homelessness and in search of the right to housing here in Atlantic Canada, that those voices are represented. And again, that'll be the start of a conversation. So that's February 27th. Please come on out, and without further ado, please join me once again in a warm thank you to John.
Thank you.